evaluate the following. And then we have 4 multiplication problems with decimals. Let's start with the first one, 1.5 times 1.7. All right. Now, there's a difference when we're multiplying decimals from when we were adding or subtracting. When we're multiplying them, we don't need to line up the decimal points. What we need to do is ignore the decimal points and stack them as we normally would by lining up the rightmost digit. So we've got 1.5 times 1.7. It does happen that the decimal points line up here, but that's not the goal. The goal is to have the rightmost digits line up. Now we're going to multiply this, and we're going to ignore the decimal points until the very end. So we're going to just pretend this was 15 times 17. 7 times 5 is 35. We carry that 3. 7 times 1 is 7, plus 3 is 10. And then we put in a 0, and we move over to the 1. 1 times 5 is 5. 1 times 1 is 1. We don't deal with that 3 because that 3 came from earlier. When we add them up, let's see, 5, 5, 2, we get 2, 5, 5. We know that's not the final answer. It would be crazy to take two numbers that are so close to 1 and multiply them to get 255. So this is where we think about the decimal point. We need to put the decimal point in the answer somewhere. And the way that we do that is by looking at the digits to the right of the decimal point in the problem. Now, there are 2 digits to the right of the decimal points in the problem. That 5 is to the right of the first decimal point, and the 7 is to the right of the other decimal point. What that means for us in our answer is we need to place the decimal point so that there are 2 digits to the right of it in the answer. The number of digits to the right of the decimal point in the problem has to be the same as in the answer. So we put the decimal point between the 2 and the 5, and we get 2.55, which is our answer. I hope everybody sees that. There's 2 digits to the right of the decimal points in the problem, so we have to place the decimal point so that there's 2 digits to the right of it in the answer. Let's try the next one. We've got 2.45 times 3.6. Again, we're going to set up the multiplication, and we don't care about the decimal points lining up. We care about the digits on the right lining up. So here, the 5 and the 6 are on top of each other. And then we multiply for getting the decimal points. Let's first start with the 6. 6 times 5 is 30. Carry the 3. 6 times 4 is 24. Plus 3 is 27. Carry the 2. 6 times 2 is 12. Plus 2 is 14. Then we put in a 0, and we move over to that 3. 3 times 5 is 15. Carry the 1. 3 times 4 is 12. Plus 1 is 13. Carry the 1. 3 times 2 is 6, plus 1 is 7. And we add these up. 7 plus 5 is 12. Carry the 1. That gives us 8. All right, so we need to figure out where to place the decimal point. If you look at the problem, there are 3 digits to the right of the decimal points in total. And so in our answer, we need to place the decimal point so that there's 3 digits to the right of it. And that gives us 8.820. And for our final answer, we can write that as 8.82. We don't need that final 0. Any zeros at the very right-hand side of a number past the decimal point are irrelevant. They're effectively placeholders, and we don't need to write them. So our final answer there is 8.82. All right, moving on to the next one, we've got 4.5 times negative 3.2. This is our first one with negatives, so we have to go back to our rules of multiplying with negative numbers. Remember, if our numbers have the same sign, it'll be positive. If they have different signs, it'll be negative. Here they've got different signs, positive times a negative, so we know our answer is going to be negative. And we can put the negative right there right now. Then we multiply them as we would. 4.5 times 3.2, lining up the numbers on the right and ignoring the decimal points as we multiply. 5 times 2 is 10, carry the 1. 4 times 2 is 8, plus 1 is 9. Then we bring down a 0 as a placeholder, and we move over to that 3. 3 times 5 is 15, carry the 1. 3 times 4 is 12, plus 1 is 13. And then we add them together. We've got 1440. We need to place the decimal point, and we're going to need 2 digits to the right of it. So it's going to go in between the two 4s, 14.40. We can just write 14.4. We remember it's going to be negative. Positive times a negative is a negative. And so our final answer here is negative 14.4. And we've got one more problem. This one's a bit of a doozy. Negative 2 times 3 times negative 4 times 5 times negative 6.5. And first, before we do any actual math, I want to think about whether the answer is going to be positive or negative. And if you look at this, you'll notice there are 3 negative numbers in this multiplication. The first 2 negatives are going to cancel. A negative times a negative gives us a positive, and that's going to leave that last negative there. So our final answer here is going to be negative. And this actually goes along the lines with a rule in math. If you're multiplying a bunch of numbers and there are some negatives in there, if there are an even number of negatives, the answer is going to be positive. And if there's an odd number of negatives, the answer is going to be negative. The reason for this, if there's an even number of negatives, they'll cancel out in pairs. So if there's 10 negatives, that's 5 pairs of negatives that cancel out. If there's an odd number of negatives, let's say there were 11 negatives being multiplied together, well, those first 10 will cancel out in pairs, and that odd one out, that last one would stay and give us a negative answer. So we don't have to keep track of all these negative signs here one at a time. We can just look at the problem and see that because there's an odd number of negatives being multiplied together, our final answer will be negative. And then from there, we can do our multiplications from left to right. So 2 times 3 gives us 6. Then when we multiply that by 4, that gives us 24. And when we multiply that by 5, 24 times 5. Let's see. 4 times 5 is 20, carry the 2. 5 times 2 is 10, plus 2 is 12. We've got 120. So this problem becomes 120 times negative 6.5. And this is where we can actually write it out. 120 times 6.5. Remember, the negative is going to cause the answer to be negative in the end. Let's do our multiplication. 5 times 0 is 0. 5 times 2 is 10. Carry the 1. 5 times 1 is 5. Plus 1 is 6. Then we bring down 0 as a placeholder. 6 times 0 is 0. 6 times 2 is 12. Carry the 1. 6 times 1 is 6. Plus 1 is 7. When we add them together, 0, 0, 8, 7. And then we need to put the decimal point in. In the problem, there's only one digit to the right of the decimal point because we know that 120 has a decimal point off on the end. So in our answer, we need the decimal point to have one digit to the right of it, which means it goes between the zeros. And so that ends up being 780. And remember, our answer was going to be negative because there were an odd number of negatives So our final answer there is negative 780.